It was 4 in the morning when the phone rang in the maintenance office of the Whitmore Tower, a glass and steel landmark overlooking the River Thames. Thomas Hale rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, and reached for the receiver. "The light's flickering again," said the night concierge. "Top floor. Miss Whitmore's apartment." Thomas exhaled quietly. Of course it is. That same penthouse had called twice this week. Always the same story, a light that refused to stay still. He grabbed his tool bag and checked his watch. He'd been on shift since 8 the previous evening, repairing broken sockets, replacing fuses, climbing stairwells that smelled of old paint and coffee. All he wanted was to go home, to see Lily, his 8-year-old daughter, still asleep under her pink blanket in their tiny flat in Croydon. But overtime meant food, school fees, rent, and he couldn't afford to say no. He zipped up his jacket, stepped into the lift, and pressed the button marked Penthouse. The elevator hummed its way upward through the dark building. Outside, London was still asleep, the streets glistening after a night of rain. When the door slid open, the air changed, cooler, scented faintly of jasmine. She was already there, waiting. Grace Whitmore, mid-30s, barefoot, wrapped in a grey silk robe. The heiress everyone in the building whispered about. Beautiful, unreachable, the only daughter of the late hotel magnate Julian Whitmore. Thomas removed his cap, suddenly aware of the oil stains on his sleeves. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, polite but weary. "You reported a lighting fault?" Grace nodded slowly. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost trembling. "Yes. I'm sorry it's so late. I just couldn't sleep. The lights kept flickering." He followed her inside. The apartment stretched out like a magazine photograph. Glass walls, white marble, furniture so pristine it looked untouched. The view reached far across the Thames, where the city lights blurred like reflections of another world. Thomas checked the fittings one by one. No faulty wiring, no voltage drop. The lamps glowed steady, perfect. "Everything seems fine," he said quietly. "Might have been a brief surge." Grace stood by the window, her silhouette caught in the pale dawn. "Perhaps I imagined it," she whispered. "It happens sometimes on this date. My father died 3 years ago tonight." Thomas hesitated. For a moment the air between them was fragile. Two strangers bound by sleeplessness and loss. "I'm sorry," he said. "I lost my wife 2 years ago. Some nights I still wake up reaching for her." Grace turned, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "You have a child?" "Yes. Lily. She keeps me going. Work helps too. Stops me from thinking too much." Grace nodded faintly. "So does mine. I run my father's company now. But the nights," she paused, her eyes glistening, "the nights are the hardest." Thomas packed up his tools, ready to leave. But as he reached for the door, she said softly, "Would you stay? Just for a coffee? I haven't spoken to anyone all night." He hesitated, long enough to remember the babysitter's number, long enough to hear his own conscience whisper, "Why not?" He nodded. "Half an hour then." For the first time, she smiled, a small, grateful curve that made the silence feel warm. As the kettle began to hum, the city outside started to glow. And neither of them knew it yet. But that flickering light had just begun to change both their lives. Grace poured the coffee herself, not a maid in sight. The sound of ceramic cups against marble was the only noise in that vast penthouse. Thomas stood awkwardly near the kitchen island, unsure whether to sit. He was used to fixing wires, not talking to people who lived above the clouds. She handed him a cup. Her hands trembled slightly. "I never sleep on this date," she said. My father built this tower. He used to say the lights should never go out. I suppose I just didn't want to be alone when they did. Thomas nodded, unsure what to say. The steam from the cup rose between them like a thin veil. He took a sip. Strong, bitter, perfect. You make a better coffee than most cafes, he said quietly. When you have everything, Grace murmured, you learn to do small things yourself, just to feel human. The words hung there, fragile and true. He looked around. Walls of glass, silver-framed art, a piano that probably hadn't been played in years. Yet the air felt lonely. Do you ever miss the simple things? He asked. Every day, she replied. But I wouldn't know where to find them anymore. Thomas hesitated. They are still out there. Small flats that smell of toast and laundry detergent. Mornings when you burn the eggs and laugh anyway. Grace smiled faintly, the kind of smile that looked like it hadn't been used for a while. You talk like someone who remembers what matters. I just fix things, ma'am. Then maybe you fix more than you realize. For a few minutes they simply sat in silence. The city below began to wake. Distant sirens, the murmur of traffic, the slow gold of sunrise creeping across the floor. Grace spoke again, her voice lower now. People think money protects you, but it only builds taller walls. You start believing you're safe until you can't breathe. Thomas listened, seeing the sadness beneath her poise. He thought of Lily, drawing pictures of castles, telling him she'd build one someday, but with open doors. My daughter, he said quietly, would like you. Grace looked up, surprised.
Why? Because she says people who look sad need friends the most. Something in Grace's face softened, a flash of emotion, quickly hidden. She sounds wiser than most adults I know. They talked until the clock showed 6, about loss, about exhaustion, about the strange comfort of strangers who ask nothing from you. When Thomas finally stood to leave, Grace followed him to the lift. Thank you, she said simply, for fixing the light and for staying. Anytime, he replied.
If it flickers again, you know who to call. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. Maybe it will. As the elevator doors closed, Thomas caught one last glimpse of her. Standing barefoot in the half-light, holding her coffee cup like it was the only warm thing she owned. Driving home through the pale dawn, he thought of Lily, still asleep. He had no idea that somewhere high above London, a woman who could buy anything was thinking about a man who wanted nothing more than time with his child. And in both their worlds, the same quiet thought took root. Maybe the light hadn't flickered by accident. A week passed. Rain fell across London in a slow, relentless drizzle, the kind that turned every streetlight into a blur. Thomas worked his usual shifts, rewiring hallways, fixing alarms, collecting payslips that never seemed enough. But every so often, when he packed up his toolbox, he caught himself thinking of her, Grace Whitmore, the woman who had spoken about loneliness as if it were an old companion. He never expected to see her again. Until, one evening near midnight, his phone buzzed. Whitmore Tower, said the concierge. Top floor again. Miss Whitmore says the lights are flickering. Thomas smiled to himself. Of course they are. He could have declined. He should have.
But part of him wanted to go, not for the job, but for the quiet voice that had thanked him that morning. The elevator carried him once more through the sleeping building. When the doors opened, Grace was waiting. But this time she looked different. No silk robe, no makeup, just jeans, a soft grey jumper, and tired eyes that had cried too recently. I'm sorry, she said, almost laughing. There's nothing wrong with the lights. I guessed as much, Thomas replied.
Rough week? You could say that. They moved to the kitchen again, their strange little ritual. She poured the coffee and he leaned against the counter, watching her hands tremble slightly as she stirred. "My aunt's furious," Grace said after a while. "She wants me to marry a business partner. A merger, she calls it. For stability." "And for you?" "A cage," Grace said softly. "Made of gold, but still a cage." Thomas nodded. "And what happens if you say no?" "She controls the board. She could push me out, take everything." "Then you'd be free," he said simply. "Scared maybe, but free." Grace looked up. Her eyes glistened. "You say that as if you know how it feels." "Because I do," Thomas murmured. "Freedom's not about having everything. It's about having enough to sleep at night." The silence stretched. Calm, heavy, honest. Grace smiled sadly. "And your daughter? Lily, was it?" "Yes, she's 8. She told me you looked lonely on the news once." Grace blinked, startled. "She said that?" "She did. Said someone should be your friend." Something fragile cracked open in Grace's expression. Not pity, but warmth. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet." They spoke for hours. About their fathers, about the weight of expectations, about the strange comfort of coffee at midnight. By the time Thomas stood to leave, it was almost 2 in the morning. "Thank you for not fixing the light tonight," she said softly. "You don't have to invent excuses," he replied, smiling. "Maybe I'll stop pretending next time." "Maybe," he said. "Just call." The elevator doors closed once more, and as he descended, Thomas caught his reflection in the metal. He looked lighter somehow. And somewhere high above, Grace stood alone by the window, watching the city below, wondering how a man who owned so little could make her feel seen for the first time in years. She whispered to herself, barely audible, perhaps the light was never broken. Sunday came with pale sunlight over South London, the kind that makes every window glow softly, even in the smallest of homes. Thomas woke early, tidied the flat, and reminded Lily not to touch the cake cooling on the counter. "Who's coming, Daddy?" "A friend," he said. "Her name's Grace." "The sad lady from the news?" Thomas smiled faintly. "That one." Lily thought for a second, then nodded decisively. "Then we have to make her smile." By noon, the little flat smelled of roast chicken and herbs. The table, an old second-hand one, polished for the occasion, looked almost festive. Thomas checked the clock again, 12:03. He was beginning to doubt she'd come. Then came the knock. When he opened the door, Grace stood there, without the armor of wealth, without the perfect posture the tabloids loved. Just jeans, a white jumper, and a box of cake in her hands. "I hope you like chocolate," she said quietly. "Who doesn't?" Thomas replied. Lily peeked out from behind her father's legs, eyes wide. "You're the lady from the TV," she said, completely serious. "But you look nicer in real life," Grace laughed, a soft, surprised sound. "Thank you. And you must be Lily." "I am," Lily said proudly. "Would you like to see my drawings?" "I'd love to." Within minutes, the penthouse heiress was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring castles and dragons beside an 8-year-old girl. Thomas watched from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, heart full of something he hadn't felt in years. Warmth. Lunch was simple but real. Roast chicken, potatoes, and laughter that came easily. Grace ate as if she hadn't tasted home in years. "This is better than anything my chefs ever made," she said, licking a bit of sauce from her finger. "That's because it's cooked with survival," Thomas smiled. She laughed. A sound that filled the room like sunlight. After dessert, Lily dozed off on the sofa, her head resting against Grace's shoulder. For a long time, neither adult moved. The moment felt too rare to break. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You don't belong in places like mine, Grace." Maybe this is where I should have been all along, she said softly. Here, people laugh without checking their watch. They sat together on the small balcony overlooking the train tracks. The sun was dipping low, the air filled with the faint hum of the city below. You know, Grace whispered, I have spent years surrounded by people who pretend to care. Tonight I don't have to pretend. Then stay, Thomas said simply. At least until the light stops flickering. Grace smiled through tears. Then I might be here a long time. He looked at her, truly looked, and realized that the woman in front of him wasn't a headline or a name on a company letterhead. She was someone trying to remember what being human felt like. That night when she left, she turned at the door and said, Next Sunday? We'll save you a seat, Thomas replied. And when the door closed, the flat didn't feel small anymore. It felt alive.
2 weeks later, Thomas stood in the gleaming lobby of Whitmore Enterprises, clutching a folded letter that had summoned him here. He had no idea why he, a maintenance man, would be called to the 32nd floor, to the office of Margaret Whitmore, Grace's aunt, and the chair of the company board. The secretary's voice was cold as glass. You can go in now, Mr. Hale. Margaret's office was a world of polished marble and silence. She sat behind a desk the size of a small car, her silver hair immaculate, her gaze sharp enough to cut steel. Mr. Hale, she began, not offering a seat. You've made yourself rather visible lately. Thomas stayed standing. I fixed the lights, ma'am. That's my job. She slid an envelope across the desk. Inside were photographs. Him and Grace laughing on the balcony, Grace hugging Lily, their Sunday lunch through the window. You see, the press loves stories like this, Margaret said. The grieving heiress and the penniless electrician. It would destroy her reputation. And ours. Thomas's jaw tightened. We haven't done anything wrong. Wrong? No. But unsuitable? Absolutely. She opened her checkbook, wrote a figure, and tore the page out with a deliberate flick. £1 million. Take it and disappear. Leave London. Your daughter will want for nothing. The paper lay between them, bright as a wound. Thomas stared at it, the zeros blurring in his vision. That money could change everything. School, rent, security. But something in him, something quiet and unbreakable, rose instead. He picked up the check, tore it in half, then again until white scraps scattered like snow across her mahogany desk. You can buy a building, Mrs. Whitmore, he said evenly, but you can't buy a man's dignity. Her eyes hardened. Then you'll learn the cost of pride. By the end of the week, you'll have no job, no home, and your child will lose her scholarship. I'll make sure of it. He held her gaze. You'd punish a child for her father's honesty? I'll do what's necessary to protect my family's name. 2 guards stepped forward. Margaret's voice never rose. Show Mr. Hale out. Outside, the winter wind bit through his jacket. London felt colder than ever. By dusk, she had kept her promise. 2 phone calls later, he'd lost both his contracts. The scholarship notice arrived by morning, funding withdrawn. That evening Grace called, her voice shaking. She told me what she did. Thomas, I'm so sorry, I tried to stop her. Don't, he said quietly. You'll only make it worse. Please, don't walk away. I have to. Lily comes first. The line went dead. The next day, the headmistress told him Lily's place at school would end by Friday. He knelt to meet his daughter's eyes. We'll find another school, sweetheart. I promise. Did we do something bad, Daddy? No, he whispered. We just told the truth. That night, as the rain returned, Lily woke with a fever. By dawn, she was screaming in pain. At the hospital, the doctor's face was grave. Acute appendicitis. We need to operate immediately, but private care requires a deposit. Thomas's account balance £200. The public list, a 3-day wait. He begged. He called friends. No one had enough.
And as he sat in the corridor, watching his child pale beneath fluorescent lights, the phone in his hand buzzed again. Grace's voice came through the static, urgent, breathless. "Where are you?" "St. Mary's. They won't operate. I can't." "Stay there," she said. "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, the doors burst open. Grace arrived still in her evening gown, rain in her hair, heels in her hand. She went straight to the desk. "Transfer her to the private wing under my name." "Dr. Albright will operate, now." The staff froze. The nurse stammered. "Miss Whitmore." "No arguments. Do it." As the gurney rolled away, Grace turned to Thomas, tears streaking her cheeks. "You once fixed my light," she whispered. "Let me save yours." He tried to speak, but the words never came. All he could do was take her hand and hold on. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and fear. Thomas sat hunched on the cold plastic chair, Grace's hand wrapped tightly in his. Beyond the swinging theater doors, machines hummed, and the clock seemed to move slower than time itself. Neither of them spoke. There were no words big enough for the silence between life and loss. After 3 hours, the surgeon appeared, weary but smiling. The operation was successful. "She's going to be fine." Thomas's knees almost gave way. Grace caught him before he fell. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Told you? Sometimes light just needs a little fixing." But the peace didn't last. The sharp sound of heels echoed down the corridor. Grace froze, even before the voice came. "So this is where you've been hiding." Margaret Whitmore, immaculate as ever, swept into the hallway like a storm in silk. Beside her walked Charles Mendel, the businessman she'd chosen for Grace, tall, polished, expressionless. "You disappeared from a gala with half the press watching," Margaret hissed. "And for what? To play Florence Nightingale to a mechanic?" Grace turned slowly, her face calm, her voice steady. "To save a life. Something you seem to have forgotten how to value." Margaret's eyes flashed. "You've disgraced this family. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," Grace said. "I've remembered what being human feels like." Thomas stood, still in his worn jacket, dirt on his boots. He met Margaret's gaze without flinching. "This isn't about class or money, it's about decency." "Decency?" Margaret snapped. "You think you can offer her anything but ruin." "I offer her honesty," he said. "And that's something your world seems to have misplaced." Charles smirked faintly. "You'll regret this, Grace. You're throwing away everything." Grace faced him. "Then so be it. I'd rather lose everything than live in a cage built by greed." Margaret's face tightened, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "If you walk away now, you're no longer part of this family. No name, no money, no company. You'll be nothing." Grace reached into her handbag, pulled out a small tablet, and tapped the screen. A video began to play, her late father's voice filling the corridor. "If you're seeing this, my child, I'm gone. The company was never meant for power, but for people. When I'm gone, turn Whitmore Enterprises into a cooperative. Let those who build it own it. Never let greed destroy what we started." The message ended. Silence fell like snowfall. Margaret's face went pale. "You wouldn't dare." "It's already done," Grace said quietly. "The board meets tomorrow. Father's will was notarized. You're finished, Aunt Margaret." For a moment, Margaret seemed to shrink, a queen dethroned. She turned on Thomas, her voice shaking. "You've taken everything from her." "No," he said softly. "I gave her back what was hers all along." Margaret's lips trembled with fury. "You'll pay for this!" Grace stepped closer, her tone calm and final. "No, you've already paid. With your soul." She took Thomas's hand. "Come on, let's go see Lily." They walked down the corridor hand in hand, leaving Margaret frozen among the sterile lights. Inside the recovery room, Lily lay asleep, her little hand resting against the blanket. Grace sat beside her, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "She's brave," Grace whispered. "She gets that from her mum," Thomas said, "and maybe a little from you." Grace smiled, tears in her eyes. "She's family now, both of you are." Outside, dawn was breaking again. The same pale light that had once flickered in Grace's penthouse now spilled gently through the hospital windows, steady, constant, and warm. For the first time in years, Grace Whitmore didn't feel alone. Lily recovered quickly. Within a few days, her color returned and the hospital corridors no longer felt like a war zone. Grace visited every morning, always with fresh flowers or a small toy in hand. She'd stay by Lily's bed for hours, reading stories, brushing her hair, laughing quietly with Thomas. But one afternoon, as she arrived, Thomas stopped her at the door. "Grace, maybe you shouldn't come today." She blinked. "Why not?" Because I can't keep taking from you. You've paid the bills, the surgery, everything. I can't accept anymore." Grace looked at him, eyes wide. "That wasn't charity, Thomas, that was love. It's not about love, it's about dignity. Your pride won't feed your child, and your money won't fix who I am." The words came out harsher than he meant, cutting through the fragile peace they'd built. Grace's face fell. "You think I pity you?" "No," he said softly. "I think you deserve someone who doesn't make you feel responsible for saving him." She hesitated, wanted to reach for his hand, but he had already turned away. "Please go home, Grace." And for the first time she did. Days passed. Grace called. Road even came by the flat. Thomas didn't answer. Lily noticed first. "Daddy, did you make Grace sad?" "It's complicated. Mommy used to say the worst thing in the world is when pride is louder than love." Her small words hit harder than any argument, but Thomas stayed silent, convincing himself he was doing the right thing. Then, one afternoon, a nurse handed him an envelope. "A note for you, Mr. Hale, from the residents of Whitmore Tower." Inside was a check. Not from Grace, but signed by dozens of tenants. "For all the nights you fixed our lights without complaint." Thomas stared at the figure. £15,000. Exactly the cost of Lily's operation. He called the concierge, Roman, his old friend. "Where did this come from?" "We collected what we could. The rest came through the building's account." "Grace?" "She sold her car, Thomas. Said she didn't want you to know." The phone slipped from his hand. For a long time he sat in silence, shame burning through him. She hadn't abandoned him. She'd protected his pride even while he pushed her away. By the time he reached the tower, it was near midnight. He took the lift up, the same one where everything had begun. When the doors opened, Grace was standing there, barefoot again, wearing the same grey jumper as the night they'd first talked. "Thomas," she whispered, surprised. "I am sorry," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "For my pride, my fear, my stubbornness, you saved my child, and I treated you like a stranger." Her eyes filled instantly. "You were never a stranger." He stepped closer, voice trembling. "You fixed everything I didn't know was broken." For a moment the world went quiet. Then she took a step forward, and he met her halfway. No promises, no grand speeches. Just a long, silent embrace. Two people who had been broken differently, learning how to fit back together. Through the wide windows of the penthouse, London shimmered beneath them. And for once, every light stayed steady. A year had passed. The tower still stood tall by the Thames, but Thomas and Grace no longer lived there. Instead, they had made a home in a modest terrace house on the edge of Surrey. A small garden, peeling paint, laughter that echoed through every room.
Grace had sold her shares in Whitmore Enterprises. The company was now owned by its employees, just as her father had wished. Margaret had vanished from the headlines. Rumors said she'd suffered a mild stroke and retired to the countryside. Grace had visited her once, not out of triumph, but forgiveness. "We all get lost chasing the wrong kind of light," she'd said, leaving a white rose by her bedside. Thomas had found steady work again, head technician at a local housing cooperative.
He came home smelling of dust, paint, and honesty. Lily adored it. "Daddy's a superhero," she'd tell the neighbors. "He fixes things nobody else can." Every evening they gathered in the kitchen. Grace stirring a pot of stew, Thomas humming out of tune, Lily chattering about school. Sometimes Grace would pause, look around the tiny room and smile. "You know," she'd say, "I used to think happiness needed chandeliers and champagne." "And now?" Thomas would ask. "Now it smells like coffee, rain, and Lily's shampoo." They laughed. It was quiet, ordinary, and perfect. One Sunday afternoon they sat in the garden, the late sun painting everything gold. Grace rested her head on Thomas's shoulder while Lily chased bubbles across the grass. "Do you ever miss your old life?" he asked softly. "Not for a moment," she said. "I had millions, but I was empty. Now I have you, and I'm full. You gave up everything." "No," she whispered. "I finally chose something real." A pause, birds in the distance, a breeze through the apple tree they'd planted that spring. Then Lily came running, hair wild in the wind. "Daddy, Mummy." The kitchen lights flickering again. Thomas grinned. "Is it?" Grace laughed, eyes glinting. "Maybe it just wants attention." "Or maybe," Thomas said, standing up, "it's reminding us how we met." He walked inside, tightened a screw, and the bulb glowed steady again. A soft golden light filling the small room. Grace watched from the doorway, her heart full. Lily tugged her sleeve. "Mummy, what if the light goes out again?" Grace knelt, smiled, and said, "Then we'll fix it. Together." Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Thomas and Grace sat by the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance.
The same London that had once divided them now shimmered quietly, like an old friend. Thomas took her hand. Funny, isn't it? Everything began with a broken light. Grace leaned into him. "No," she said softly. "It began when someone cared enough to stay." They watched as the moon rose over the rooftops, and for the first time in a long time there was nothing left to repair. Only peace. The light in their kitchen stayed on all night, warm, steady, unbroken.